Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and in this essay I'd like to do a presentation on the Jewish activist perspective and looking at the work of Jewish activist historians in observing the early years of Hitler's Third Reich. So that's the purpose of this. Now I've got a number of texts that I'm referring to, and I'm doing a sort of a synthesis of all of them. I guess the main one I'm looking at is a book called The Social History of the Third Reich by Richard Grunberger, and looking at that, I suppose, as the core, and comparing some of the facts that each claims, because there's quite a lot of contradiction in this. But I've purposefully picked, it's not hard, the only Jewish historians I can find that cover this period are all activists. You know, you wouldn't call any of them independent or impartial, but it's their perspective on the Third Reich. Now, I haven't scripted or structured this, but I have made some notes, so it may jump around just a little bit, but I'll try and keep some sort of continuity to this. Just to give you an idea, one of the historians who's writing his perspective in quite a prominent text is a Jewish communist homosexual. And he mentions the oppression of homosexuals at every opportunity in his take of the Third Reich. So this is again a synthesis of all these Jewish writers or historians, as they claim to be. Now they say Germany was unique amongst the industrial powers, as in the first world industrial powers, that it sought class, industrial, religious, and social consensus, rather than political activism or a politically active middle class clamouring for more power. This is again a reflection of the Jewish attitude to what politics should be, social change and all that sort of stuff. So the Germans built a very harmonious, very advanced technical industrial society that was very successful, and they were able to achieve high levels of consensus, much higher than nearly any other advanced economy of the day, and still do, by the way, or until recently at least. So this is the position. This is touted as a weakness, or presented as a weakness by these Jewish historians. They have a vision that if there was a middle class clamouring for more power and there was conflict and disruption, that this somehow would have impeded Hitler coming to government. I don't agree with that sort of. So social stability and economic well-being and harmony, social harmony, were accepted in lieu of abstract political rights, which again is presented as a weakness. I would see it as a strength. But anyway, that's the take. Now, the legitimacy of the Weimar Constitution. So when World War I ended, the Germans effectively had a constitution, not so much imposed upon them, but demanded of them, and that constitution must meet certain criteria. So it wasn't like they were independently selecting it or choosing it, or that there were impositions there. Now, for some reason, and this caused much disquiet in the time, and later on, and the National Socialists used this to much effect, was out of all the lawyers and constitutional lawyers and so on they could have picked to write the Constitution, they happened to pick a Jewish lawyer who was also a social justice activist, Hugo Preuss, or Preuss. Now, the key cohort of politicians, as in the senior level politicians that sort of decided to go ahead with this, because Preuss just did a draft really in the first instance. Again, out of every lawyer they could have picked in the entire Germany, they happened to pick a social justice Jewish activist to write the Constitution. I would view that as being rather silly. But anyway, that's what happened. Now, of the 11 senior politicians that voted for it or approved it to go through to final stage, 5 of the 11 were Jews. Again, this was something that was used later on, that out of all the politicians in all of Germany, nearly half of the politicians that approved it are Jewish. The guy who wrote it was Jewish. This is insane. I mean, 0.5% of the population is Jewish. Now, the socialist president of the interim government was a trade union activist, very leftist. Again, a lot of Jews in his cohort. and other senior people there again, as I mentioned, were Jewish. Now the Jewish historians, again, they're writing in sort of, this is say between 1965 and 1975, late 1970s. So I'm picking that sort of period of history. The main one I'm looking at was written in 1970. The Jewish historians assert Germans were implacably opposed to democracy and the rule of law, which is quite absurd. And because they are implacably opposed to democracy, they must be treated with any necessary brutality and forced to accept a democracy that others may impose upon them. I can't believe that anyone would write something like that or even assert it or infer it. They assert that the government, or the Nazis by extension, is authoritarian, but they say at the same time that armed communist revolution within a government imposed at the point of a gun is not authoritarian and is in fact more democratic because it's supposed to somehow represent equality. Now, equality has always had a special place. Communist equality has always had a special place in the sort of the Jewish mindset, because it purports to deliver a completely equal society, and therefore Jews will never be persecuted again, is the kind of secondary level understanding or logic that the Jews apply to it. And I think that's a deeply flawed logic, but anyway, I'll come back to that a little bit later in this text. Germany was not doing so well after the war. There was massive inflation and shortages of food, and in that a couple of harsh winters, people were dying from deprivation there. But Germany started to pick up sort of by 1925, and there were some American loans that came in. This is in the heyday of the Roaring Twenties, as it was called. And by the late 1920s, German machine goods, machine tools, things like that, manufacturing and exports had actually exceeded that of the United States. Electoral production equaled that of France and Britain combined. So Germany's a big economy. But 30% of the people, of the workers, were still agricultural workers. I mean, Germany is quite a big country overall. Now, the public service was about 20% of the workforce, which is more than double that of the pre-war years. About 30% of the population were deemed as proletariat. Approximately 12 million people, this is still Weimar Republic, 12 million people were in trade unions, and they had the power of collective bargaining. The days, this comes back to the harmony of the German thing, the days lost to strikes in Germany, this goes all, these are even include strikes where, say, the owners of the factories locked the workers out, so that includes both. But the days lost to strikes in Germany were less than half of that of Britain, and Germany had quite a much larger workforce. After 1930, given again the Wall Street crash and the Depression, and again the constant drama with communist street goons and attempted coups and communist uprisings, no government could form a majority. So there was effectively an illegitimate minority government, but it was decided that they could survive using decree powers of the president. This was what eventually Hitler was brought in to overcome. The government was seen as, it can't form a majority. You say it's a democracy, but the government can't form a majority, so therefore what can we do to get a majority? And no government could form a majority without Hitler's party as part of the government, which eventually, of course, they had to do. But the disunity and the wider drama in the Weimar Republic sort of can't be ignored. Quite apart from an illegitimate minority government being propped up by presidential decree, there was rampant gay, lesbian propaganda and sex changes, transgenderism, and the Jewish historians, interestingly, they do concede that went on, but they pass over it as these are merely creative impulses. Without any moral significance. So they just bypass that straight away. Now, when you've got people like Hirschfeld and so on saying, hey, we can just change your gender with a cut of the knife, and there's plays and movies and gay lesbian houses everywhere. It's out of control, and this is just dismissed as creative impulses with no moral significance. Yet, if any attempt to stop or restrict these creative impulses is brutal authoritarianism. Now, it's interesting that it's presented as such. Now, that these creative impulses, or the people involved in it, were overwhelmingly Jewish and communist and gay, lesbian, etc., is passed over. Academia is also portrayed as opposing democracy and being chauvinistic and misogynistic and so on and so forth. This is alleged as laying the groundwork for the Nazis to take over. It's hard to see things that way, but as the Nazis and other commentators to observe was that relative to population, Jews are overrepresented in academia by about 25 times. Now that could be the Jewish better quality of education. They're very bright people. I've worked with a lot of Jewish people, and they're very bright. I've been in awe of how clever some of them are. Not all of them, but some of them are. So I accept that the Jews may be overrepresented in the apex of academia. Einstein, for example, but 25 times no. So the academia is German academia is generally portrayed as not only far right, but they're just kind of hanging around waiting for a Hitler, anybody to turn up. This again goes into Jewish mythology, that every generation is going to produce a Hitler. So that really plays back into Jewish mythology there, rather than relying on any facts. But again, the tendency by these historians to say that armed revolution at the point of a gun, an armed communist government, killing people who don't agree with them is permissible, if not desirable. Because it's better than Hitler coming along. Is it? You mean Stalin was such a good guy because tens of millions died, but that makes him better than, I don't know. But being unimpressed with the Weimar Republic, that where the government was weak and where again this moral decline was everywhere, that's pure evil. So if you're against the Weimar Republic, then you're already a sort of a closet Nazi. Now, in some universities, they had popular votes by the senior students and the academic staff on should Jews be denied places in university or limited to being broadly representative of the Jewish population, and this is considered an outrage. It should be overridden by the state, according to these historians. But if Nazis are denied university places, then this is heralded as a good. It's right, and it is democratic somehow, even if they're arbitrarily denied it. That disturbed me. If it's wrong to say, well, just because you're Jewish, you shouldn't have a place or too many places at university, then it's the same thing. It's wrong to say that Jewish communists. You're wrong to say that Nazis aren't allowed. National Socialists. If it's wrong for both, it's wrong for all. Surely, why be selective? That's right if we do it. I don't accept that, and I noticed that in the narrative around today. Things that are done by Trump are written off as evil. But exactly the same things done by the Democrats. No, that's right. It's okay when we do it. And you see that same architecture of propaganda today as back in the 1960s and 70s. Now, support for the Nazi Party is allegedly higher among uni students and university administrators and general population. I'm not sure I agree with that, but that's an assertion made by more than one of these historians. Now, the moral decline or the Jewish involvement in Weimar Germany they don't accept moral decline, these historians, but they do accept that Jewish involvement in, like, the gay, lesbian and the transgender operations, so on. They do accept the Jewish involvement in that, but it's put forward or portrayed, and again, we're talking late 60s, early 70s, it's portrayed as advanced and progressive, whereas to oppose it is atavistic or old-fashioned. Now, or evil and fascist even to oppose it. Now, I don't know how you can hold you accept there's moral decline in the involvement. You say instead moral decline is creative impulses, but say it's advanced and progressive. How? How is it advanced and progressive? Because there's some abstract notion of equality. Why is it opposing it or disagreeing with it, even evil and fascist? That doesn't make any sense either. But it's consistent with the propaganda we see today. Now, the writers, each of the historians actually agree that Jewish cartels had an oversized influence in banking, real estate, stockbroking, media, finance, agricultural trading blocks, and so on. The media, for example, had a large Jewish diaspora in there, and they portrayed Hitler from the earlier days really as a frothing at the mouth madman, and were presented him in the most negative light imaginable. This is like in the mid-20s or something, long before he'd become chancellor. But even in 1930, they insist, this is the historians insist, the hatred towards Jews was the most marked hatred of Jews ever in human history, of all of human history. It's in 1929-30 was the most. Now this is an absurd and ridiculous claim. What about the Russian pogroms? What about the Jews, and the Romans, and I mean the list goes on, and the eviction of Jews in so many countries. And the Jews are not being evicted or anything like that in Weimar Germany here, but yet they're trying to portray that already it's the worst ever in human history. Now that sort of hyperbolic sort of representation is bullshit and is way over the top. So it causes people to who would otherwise maybe have some sympathies with this to look at this and say, hey, hold on a minute, there's plenty of stuff here amongst the Nazis, plenty of stuff here to talk about that is bad and depressing and things we should be aware of, should be talked about. Plenty of stuff, and yet you go off on these hyperbolic rants that where you invent this narrative, this apparition of evil that didn't exist. Now the Gentile press or the media that wasn't controlled by the Jewish diaspora comes in for quite a lot of criticism, actually, because the Gentile press didn't make a big emotional narrative about any perceived anti-Semitic event. Now, remember, the Jewish diaspora is recording every, the tiniest slight is being recorded as something. So the Gentile media would report it, say a Jewish communist street activist goon got murdered or died in some sort of a street fight thing. The media the Gentile media would report on that, so and so of Berg or Stein got murdered or killed or died, but the Jewish the Jewish historians say no, you can't just stick to the facts. You should and must and create this hyperbolic wider narrative about the evilness of all the people involved, and you have to turn it into a frenzy of emotional venting. And the fact that because the Gentile media just stuck to the facts means that you were playing along and playing a big role in creating the Hitler. If you'd gone full hyperbolic on this, then maybe we could have stopped Hitler. No. The media is there to report the facts. That's their job. And the Jews or these historians at least, are looking back and saying, no, you should have turned it into a monster frenzy type narrative. In fact, you didn't mean you created Hitler, you damn Nazi. I don't accept that, and I don't agree with it. Now, where Nazi goons, and remember, communist goons and Nazi goons were fighting street battles all over the place. It was, and when Nazi goons killed a communist Jewish revolutionary in the street, this is portrayed the Jewish historians portrayed as senseless, brutal murder of a sweet innocent. But when Nazis are murdered by the communist street goons, irrelevant. They deserved it anyway. Damn fascists. So again, I don't like that lack of balance. If you again, plenty of bad stuff to lock onto, but this very one-sided depiction of what was happening, it just doesn't create the sympathy it's supposed to be engendering. It may, an angry sort of Jewish fanatic activist may think, I love hearing this stuff, but it doesn't do anything for people outside of that activist diaspora. Now, the Jewish historians do concede the achievements of the Nazi government, grudgingly, and they give a very small amount of time to it or copy to it. But within 12 months of coming to government, the National Socialists, with Hitler as Chancellor, had almost halved unemployment. So unemployment was 6 million when the Nazis came to government. By the end of that year, only 12 months later, it was down to 3.3 million. Now, there's all sorts of weird claims that, well, the Nazis just opened up, a million armaments factories, and that's where that's bullshit, absolute bullshit. There was jobs in public works, in particular the autobahns, things like that. Also, the Nazis were quite big on, you may not think this, but beautifying areas. So they'd go into areas where there were factories, sterile-looking neighbourhoods, and they'd plant trees and flowers and gardens and so on to beautify the area and create outdoor areas where workers could sit and have their lunch and so on. Doesn't sound very Nazi, but that's what they did. Now, by that was 1934. Employment's gone from 6 million to 3.3 million. But 1936, 2 years later, the unemployment was close to zero. That was how quickly the Nazis acted on what were perceived by the Weimar government as utterly intractable problems that just were beyond solutions. Now, the people now had jobs, rents had come down, and they could afford consumer goods and so on. Now, any government that can deliver that will be popular. Any government that can deliver that will be popular. Nonetheless, in these Jewish histories, they instead of saying, well, no wonder the people were pleased with Hitler's government and giving those sort of results. Instead, they've portrayed it as, well, the Germans are just ideologically indoctrinated. Hitler mesmerised them somehow. We don't know how. We just don't understand. It's because they're all crazy Nazis and authoritarian. No, bullshit. Hitler and his government delivered on reducing unemployment from 6 million to 3 years later, it's almost zero. And the people knew they had a government that was delivering not only jobs and prosperity and more purchasing power for the paycheck, but it was delivering stability. The days of Nazi and fascist, Nazi and communist goon squads battling it out on the street, shootouts and all sorts of things. That was all gone. The streets were quiet, they were clean, and crime was falling rapidly and so on. Now, the Jewish historians say, well, no, actually the Germans were just so scared of Hitler, that the SS was going to come along and just murder everybody. There'd be nobody left. That they supported Hitler only because they were terrified. This, again, is utter nonsense. They didn't embrace Hitler out of fear, as suggested. Hitler delivered, or his government, and it wasn't just him. I mean, he had that economics minister he had was particularly efficient and effective. And that Hitler hired such a capable person should be seen as something. But when you reduce unemployment in 3 years from 6 million to zero, and people have got money in their pockets and their lives are infinitely better, that they will support you and be appreciative. And that would happen anywhere in the world with any people at any time in any circumstances. Now, the Jewish social logic or sociological logic, if you like, had a way of applying, and it's a uniquely Jewish logic, to the behaviour of others who may persecute them. So this idea that the Jews have about persecution and how it begins. So any initial sign that they would see as being the beginning of persecution of their diaspora, such as today, they see any attempt to limit mass migration to skilled migration, they just bang. Hitler, fascist, Nazi, Holocaust, straight to that. Within seconds, they've already gone down that road. Now, it's something that's to me at least, it sticks out worth noting that as the Jews will assert, the majority of persecutions, in their perspective at least, have come from Christian Gentiles, whether it's the Russian pogroms or whatever, the Spanish Catholics and so on, has come from Christian Gentiles. Therefore, they're the biggest danger. They're the ones that must be controlled and watched and monitored, and the slightest sign that there's another Hitler appearing, then the Jews have to jump up and down and get very, very active in media and politician lobbying and all that sort of stuff. Now, you could put that argument. I don't agree that it's that straightforward, but the Jewish diaspora has chosen to only go into the white Gentile societies, the Christian society. That's where the Jews don't go to basket case countries or places in Africa and decide to go there en masse. It's only into the rich, and the Christian Gentile societies tend to be, whether you're looking at the Roman Empire or the advanced economies of the mercantile and industrial age, or later the industrial age, then the money and the wealth is in the white Gentile Christian countries, and that's where the Jews choose to go. So they could choose to go somewhere else, but don't. It's there they choose to go. That's where the money is. So when you compare when you look at the desire to go only to those rich countries and not to other places like basket case African countries, for example, when you look only at the desire to go there, it becomes a double-edged sword, because why do you go to a place like? Why do you go to a place like an advanced Western economy? There's the rule of law, due legal process, courts. There's all sorts of orderly type public service functions and so on there. There's wealthy citizens you can do business with, and so on. So once you take away the power of the Gentile Christians, which is certainly on the cards today, whether you're looking at Larry Fink or whoever, the World Economic Forum, once you take away then all that order that the Gentile Christians bring, all those courts and all that sort of stuff that they bring with them, once that's all gone, then what do you do? Because the Jews the Jewish diaspora will, in my view at least, simultaneously fear the Gentile Christians for what they might do, but equally hide behind the protections and the laws and the economies and economic structure and the edifices that these same societies create. So if you eradicate one, get rid of the Jewish Gentile Christians and their power, then you equally at the same time eradicate the other. And I think that will be a terrible move. That will be an Armageddon move for the Jewish diaspora, in my view. But that's only my thoughts. Now, there's a claim here by the Jewish historians that even before the Nazis, the German state, this is still the Weimar Republic, had the tightest control of citizens and their behaviour in history, which the Nazis tightened even further, this authoritarian regimentation. I don't agree with that for a minute. On one side, the Jews are saying people could run rampant with homosexuality and lesbianism and as a creative impulses, they say, but at the same time, so everybody was controlled to the nth degree and couldn't do anything. You can't have both there, and I think it's a preposterous claim. Even the Nazi government efficiency was derided by these historians as its only motivation was its efficiency to kill Jews. Again, this is an insane assertion. Now, there's also claims that some of these historians are making the Germans were too frightened to go to hospital in case that they might have made some inappropriate utterance while under the anaesthetic and would have the Gestapo come along and kill them. I mean, that's ridiculous. But this is part of this excitable emotional frenzy narrative that Jewish historians and writers love to build around things. Stick to the facts. You've got plenty of facts there to present a negative story, and you clearly want to present a negative story. Stick to those facts. But instead, you're ginning up this crazy fantasy narrative of things. And it also just gives away the propaganda intent of the narrative. There's also I noticed in Jewish writers, particularly in the North America, is they jump around. So they'll talk about an event in 1930, for example, and then take an example from something that happened in 1944 and marry the two together as if it all happened at the same time, when it didn't. It was 14 years and in very different circumstances. One was Weimar peacetime, the other was Nazi Germany being invaded from east and west, and with the accompanying paranoia. So, but that's not explained, which they should do. Crimes regarding, if you look at the stats, crimes regarding prison sentences fell very considerably since the Nazi government came to power. Like more than 30% the crimes fell. This is again requiring a prison sentence, or even worse, hanging or execution. At the same time, these Jewish historians are asserting that the Nazis were going crazy, locking up everybody they could lay their hands on. So prison sentences fall by 30%, yet everyone's getting arrested and thrown in prison. The two can't be together. So again, you see this inconsistency throughout. And even as you compare two Jewish, one will cite that the prison sentence crimes fell by that amount, but the other one will say everyone's getting arrested. So again, you see this desire to go to emotional narrative rather than stick to the facts. Hermann Goering is dismissed as a corpulent, blithering idiot, yet his utterances by the historians are used simultaneously as concrete proof of Nazi policy. Goering said it, you can rely on it, but hold on a minute, next page he's a blithering idiot and you can't rely on anything he says. Also, there's constant reference to how corpulent he was, but that corpulence, came over much later as the war progressed. He wasn't, of course, he's he's a highly accomplished flying ace in World War One, and whilst you wouldn't have called him svelte in the 1930s, he nonetheless wasn't a corpulent mass of hulking flesh, as one historian describes him. Now the claim is that German citizens are trembling in fear of the Nazis, yet at the same time they're saying that German confidence, because this is how easily duped the Germans are, confidence in government and levels of public trust is very high, which the Jewish historians concede, far higher than it was in the Weimar era, and even higher than it was in pre-World War One years. So how can citizens be trembling in fear of the knock on the door, and yet their public trust is incredibly higher than it's ever been? Again, you can't have both. Similarly, there is not one passage anywhere in any of these history that I've seen, at least, that has even one word of criticism about Stalin or Trotsky or any of those sort of people. Not one, or referencing later on Mao and these. Not one criticism. And the only comment they make about the communists is that they were producing some fucking utopia, which of course is simply not true. They were murdering tens of millions of people, and yet not one word of criticism in these histories about it. And yet they'll talk about things that the Nazis were doing, that the communists were doing on infinitely greater and more brutal levels. Not to mention about the communists, only the Nazis about. Now, birth rates, which is a good indication, by the way, of confidence in your government in the future. Birth rates almost tripled from 1933 to 1941. Again, very much an indication of the confidence that the Germans had here. There are constant attempts, by the way, just to make the Germans look bad without any real purpose or point to it. Just a frenzied attempt. So and claims that are just sort of rumour mongering stuff, like all German soldiers carried photos in their wallets or their papers, depicting the most graphic, brutal, gruesome murder scenes of people, and they carried this around and were getting off on it. I just don't believe that happened. Maybe they found one that did, or some sort of insane SS officer or doing it. But this idea that every German soldier or most of them were doing that, again, ridiculous, can be dismissed out of hand. Now, Germans are denounced generally as being anti-brain, as it's called, anti-brain or anti-intellectual, because only dumb people could have been sucked in by Hitler, of course. Yet this is the same Germany that produced the most advanced machine tools in the world, the most advanced technological weapons, jet engines, rocket engines, and all this sort of stuff. So the idea that the Nazis and Germans generally are all low IQ, moron fanatics, incapable of being practical and so on is just mad nonsense. It's just crazy nonsense. Now, the other thing Nazis were doing, and everything the Nazis did, is they've tried these historians try to present it or represent it as somehow an act of evil. For example, the Nazis were sponsoring days in the parks, outdoor parks, or even in town halls, where they would have travelling symphony musicians would do things like Beethoven symphonies or Mozart symphonies and so on. Mozart and Beethoven both being Germanic musicians and writers of symphonies. But even this is portrayed somehow as sinister. So Hitler liked Beethoven symphonies, therefore Beethoven and his music must somehow be evil because Hitler liked it. So Hitler drinks water when he's thirsty, therefore water is evil. I mean, how does this work exactly? The media, similarly, where it's Gentile media, is derided as trivial and ludicrous, and where someone uses an aristocratic title, for example, which is old Germany, and the Nazis discouraged that, and this is mentioned in the press, then this is considered as why would you even bother covering that? But when the Nazis misgender somebody, that's seen as the height of cruelty. So this again, we see very much this Jewish perspective on things. Now, the idea of all Germans being Nazi fanatics, where really only 10% of the population were Nazi Party members, you could spread that out in saying someone who, say, was a member of the Hitler Youth, but then did not later on become a a member of the Nazi Party, or there were various sort of German nationalist type organisations you could join, as there was, by the way, the same type of organisations in Britain and France and elsewhere. It was hardly unique to Germany. So the idea of presenting this as some uniquely German or Nazi thing is just simply not true. So now, again, in the Soviet Union and the communist countries where mass communist membership was seen as mandatory, where you can be killed for not being sufficiently ardent in your revolutionary fervour, the Nazis didn't go anywhere near that far. And if you look at the amount of secret police that exist in communist societies, the amount of secret police that existed in German society, and the secret police one was non-existent in the early days of Hitler's administration. When the war came on, particularly as the war started to go badly, then it changed. But at this time there were many more times the secret police and informers and so on. Now the historians make a big deal about the Nazis encouraging Germans to inform on each other for immoral behaviour or something like that, and this they say, well, there you go, that shows how authoritarian and evil the Nazis were. And yet today we have Jewish activist organisations combing the internet looking for even one word out of place, and making a huge hue and cry about it. So that's considered acceptable. But when the Nazis do it, it's bad. But it's good when other again, this inconsistency is off-putting. Also an obsession, even in 1969-70, this constant reference in the Jewish historians about unequal power relationships, which we see today as very much part of the race, gender and LGBTQ hustling that we see today. Constant reference to unequal power relationships. And I didn't realise that the Jewish activists were talking about this in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Now, the Nazis were derided as small-town, lower-middle-class, misogynist, racist, and with just a high school education. Ooh-ah. Now, the number of people that went to university back in the day was quite small. So this highbrow look at, well, the Nazis just have a high school education is the same that you see today. Those Trump voters, they just went to high school. They didn't do gender studies at university. Therefore, they must be Nazis. That I didn't realise that was coming across in the 1960s and 70s. Any Nazi that, or part of that sort of group that did possess quite obvious high intelligence, the Jewish historians dismissed that. No, it wasn't really intelligence. It was just low animal cunning. Oh, fuck. The courts during the Nazi era were derided as evil and corrupt. And yet, the amount of people that could appeal lower court, go to an appeal court to appeal lower court rulings, particularly lower middle class folks that often had to rely on legal aid supplied by the Nazis, those evil Nazis, then that's something that they couldn't seem to reconcile. So they the historians just dismiss it as an aberration. Now they also have a big thing about the Nazis were mad, insane pagans. The proof and evidence of that was that they one of the national holidays was commemorating either the first day of summer or the solstice. I'm not sure which, but this is that's proof they were damn pagans. I mean, fuck. No, that's not the case. That was going on for 1,000+ years. So that had nothing to do with the Nazis. Now also, again, this is inconsistent with timing. An event that happened in 1938 was supposedly denounced by Vladimir Lenin of Russian Revolution fame, but Lenin had died in 1924, and the event occurred in 1938. Yet somehow this historian has Lenin denouncing it 14 years. he died 14 years earlier. And these sort of inconsistencies, by the way, were all over. Very, very sloppy writing in my view. But it's the sort of stuff you see today in the media today, that incredible sloppiness. There was a Jewish politician that was caught in, was photographed, and he wasn't a fit man, and so he was derided by the German media as being overweight and out of condition. The historians here say, because the guy was Jewish, they say this was hateful and racist and yet they simultaneously deride Hermann Goering as being overweight and corpulent and obscene and so on. Again, I don't know how you sort of manage those inconsistencies. Now, supposedly homosexuals were being persecuted. It was rampant persecution. Insane levels of persecution. Now, bear in mind that homosexuality was a crime, all across the Western world at the time, and the penalties were severe. But the supposed persecution of homosexuals was less than 10,000 prosecutions per year for homosexuality, and quite a few of those were proved that they were, they weren't going to fly in court, so they were dropped. And some of those were just people, neighbours trying to get even with each other. Somebody may have said a word out of place. Yeah, I'll fix you, buddy. I'll say you're homosexual. So those type of things. And equally, there were plenty of prosecutions happening in the United States and in Britain and so on. So this idea that it was uniquely Nazi Germany, then it's not true. Simply not true. Yet overall, if you compare the histories, sex crime prosecutions in Nazi Germany were less overall than they were in the Weimar Republic. So that's something. Now that's just my view on these things, but I see it as relevant because instead of sticking to the facts, and there were plenty of them that again could paint Nazi Germany in negative light. You wouldn't have to try that. There's a lot of raw material there, but instead they deviate from that. And they go straight into this hyperbolic frenzy of narrative building and creation and fantasy building, which is what they do today. And I don't think anything has changed. The lessons of the past clearly haven't been learned, and it's a tragedy that they haven't been. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.